Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Eric. I'm a product manager at Snowflake. I'm joined by Chris, co-founder of Omnata. And today we're going to talk about how to implement your monetization strategy on Snowflake. So we'll cover kind of a lot of how monetization works on Snowflake, really what it is, and kind of give you an overview of like marketplace monetization generally. I'll talk a little bit about some of the observations I've seen working on this problem for about 4 years at Snowflake. Kind of the biggest, I'd say, challenges some of our customers face. And that'll tee up Chris's talk around how they went and kind of started thinking about their monetization strategy. And one of the things I really enjoyed about working with Chris and his team at Omnata, James is here as well, they were really early to native apps, they were really early to monetization. And they're really, truly like a design partner in the whole process. So along the way, I kind of had the privilege of being a fly on the wall of both them developing their monetization strategy, and they were kind of a fly on the wall for us developing our monetization capabilities. And they really took kind of a customer-centric approach. So I think it really reinforces some of the things that I think are kind of best practices for thinking about how to develop your monetization strategy. And really in the early days, it was interesting because every time I talked to them, I'd ask them, what exactly do you want to do? What models do you need? And every time their answer would change. And that's pretty typical, I think, in early product development. You're evolving your product, you're trying to figure out, what exactly works for your customers. But one of the things that really resonated was kind of really how customer-centric they were. So I think that really reinforces a strategy that works at all stages of product, be it early or existing, mature, et cetera. So we'll talk a little bit about, what are we talking about, with monetization on Snowflake. So the most kind of basic way to explain it is, we provide kind of billing and metering right out of the box for you to monetize your applications and data products directly on Snowflake. Our goal is to really reduce your development costs, speed up your time to value, or time to close, I should say, for all your sales on platform, but also reduce the procurement overhead that's really slowing that down. And that'll allow you to really easily grow revenue within Snowflake. You can sell both publicly and privately. So we have public listings where you can put a product out there, can have a price, try and buy type of experience. But you can also sell privately, which obviously, most enterprises do sell privately per customer, certain types of value they're delivering on a per customer basis. We have a myriad of monetization models, which I'll kind of talk about shortly, to really, I think, hopefully address kind of any type of monetization strategy you want to employ. And another thing to think about is, when your customers purchase, the invoicing really comes from Snowflake. So there's no need for these customers to kind of add a vendor. They're already Snowflake customers. So I think that reduces kind of some procurement risk when the procurement teams see that ultimately, this is from Snowflake. Along the way, we offer end-to-end reporting as well. So all trials, usage of your products, purchases, charges, payments, disbursements to you, payouts, reporting is right out of the box. And it's completely opt-in. Should you choose to monetize off platform, you may. The only thing we charge you for are a 3% fee on your disbursements. So all payouts to you are, we take a 3% fee to cover our payment processing, invoicing, billing operations, and costs to support this functionality. It's been in GA for over 2 years now, so it's not any announcements to make about this. We support around 30 plus consumer countries. So it's not by deployment, it's by country to buy on platform. And around 15 countries for providers and sellers to sell on platform. And we continue to invest very heavily here. So here's the models that we offer today. So at the highest level, we have usage-based and flat rate pricing. So think of usage-based kind of as Snowflake On Demand or pay-go, pay-as-you-go. We bill customers monthly in arrears, sum up their charges, they get an invoice in the following month. And then flat rate, we're all familiar with this, all you can use for some period of time, 1 to 36 months. It can be recurring, non-recurring. We offer installments if you're a customer and you have, certain kind of payment terms that you want to negotiate over the lifeline of the deal. Maybe the first year, the price is lower. It's a step up in the second year. Really, there's a lot of flexibility with flat rate. Our usage-based story allows for, per query per month, only charged when usage occurs on your listing. We have 2 surcharge models, one by credits, another by compute pools. Snowpark Container Services is now in public preview. We are releasing, as a part of this summit, Snowpark Container Services Compute Pool surcharge into private preview, so you can effectively do a cost-plus model on top of infrastructure charges for Snowpark Container Services. We also have custom event billing, which allows you to meter for anything that happens in the context of your native application. Omnada will talk about that at a little bit more length. That's actually the model that they've chosen. And as I mentioned, that's billed monthly in arrears. And we have a myriad of different trialing options. So if you want to offer your customers the ability to trial your product for some period of time, for some amount of functionality, say certain stored procedures or certain functionality of your app, they can get access to. You can also limit that by time. And we also have usage-based models that are, the rest are in GA, but usage-based models are in private preview. In terms of payment, consumers get an invoice that's separate from their Snowflake invoice, but we do accept all common forms of payment, pay by invoice, which effectively means the customer can pay via ACH, wire transfer, SWIFT for international payments, credit card, and perhaps most popularly amongst our providers is the ability for our customers to use their Snowflake commitment to pay for your applications or your data on the marketplace. So they're effectively setting aside part of their commitment to be used on marketplace. That was announced last summit in a USGA, and we are now in private preview in the UK. So Snowflake Marketplace capacity drawdown, as I mentioned, really big draw for a lot of our providers. This really kind of speaks to our commitment to reduce the procurement cycles for you. A large percent of our customers are automatically opted into this program when eligible. We do not need providers or sellers to opt into this program. You are automatically paid out in dollars if your customer uses this. We don't pay you in any exotic cryptocurrencies or anything, credits or anything like that. You get paid in dollars. And if your customers are eligible, they can just use their commitment and purchase your applications or paid data sets directly on platform. So this program is expanding quickly. As I mentioned, we've expanded internationally now. We're expanding pretty quickly both internationally in terms of capabilities and of course, as I mentioned, geographic coverage. So big investment in this program to support our partners to grow on platform. So this is kind of a section around some of the observations I've seen. I'm working on this problem for the last 4 years. And I think a lot of partners, they don't actually struggle with, I'd say, even though it talks about implementing, and I kind of maybe a technical audience is, might think, okay, well, how do I actually, code this thing or implement it? Snowflake? That's actually the easy part. A lot of providers don't struggle with that. I think the harder part is really, how do you actually develop a monetization model that's kind of compelling in this new world of, say, usage-based pricing, applications on Snowflake, all these different options that you have. And so I think we'll spend a lot of time there because I think that's really where I see most partners struggle. And ultimately, to the extent to which you are really focused on your customer, you really understand their problems, and I'll kind of walk through a couple frameworks to kind of think about this. That's really where your competitive advantage can lie. So Omnada, I think, is a really interesting example of somebody, in a pretty crowded market. And they've ultimately looked at, where there were opportunities amongst their competition, where customers were frustrated with certain types of pricing models, and use that to their advantage. And really, you can do the same. And it's something that I think ultimately has to be top of mind for anyone developing a product. So we'll start there, and then I'll talk a little bit about, the types of risks or how to continually evolve this model, when to make changes, how to think about it more holistically. And another thing that kind of will close out with in this section is really when to think about self-serve, sales assist, or sales-led. The kind of TLDR there is I think a lot of companies are obviously doing more sales-led motion or maybe a sales-assisted motion. I think there still is a really big opportunity in having a self-serve type experience. And so I'll kind of give some best practices in that and why I think that can actually help grow your qualified leads on platform so they understand your product before you're talking to them, and potentially, in some cases, purchasing really on their own without involving sales. And so with all product development, it really starts with understanding the customer. So it's pretty straightforward, right? What is the problem you're solving? How does the customer describe this in their own words? You really can't skip these steps, and I'll kind of make the argument in the next couple of slides why. But really starting with this is really critical. And I think if you do, I think you ultimately leave opportunity or money on the table. And while your ultimate goal might be to drive revenue, You want to minimize disconnects between your customer's kind of point of view and your business's point of view. And it is hard work, and it does take time. It's a lot like product development. You have to pay attention to it. You have to talk to customers, and that's one thing Chris will talk about, I think. Ultimately, they talk to almost every customer who purchases. They understand how they think about their pricing, how they think about their product, and those types of patterns of feedback can help inform when you might make evolutions or changes. So as I mentioned, it's important to start with, what is the problem you're solving, and who are you solving them for? Pretty straightforward. You might have kind of, be in a space where customers are ultimately, you're solving the same problem, but you might solve for, an SMB versus an enterprise. Think of like a CRM space. You've got HubSpot, you've got Salesforce. These are very different markets. And being really crisp on those things is critical. You have markets where you kind of have the same product, but maybe different personas. Of course, Uber is an example, where they have Uber Pool. Customers who use Uber Pool on a regular basis probably are different than customers who use, the luxury Uber Black. So knowing, exactly in your market, who are you solving for, what problems, and you might need to treat those differently as you think about pricing. And then ultimately, what alternatives do these customers have? This is another part of the story that I think is really interesting as Chris goes on and talks about how they approach their monetization model. What else exists in the market? What pros and cons do those options have? How does your customer think about those alternatives? How do they think about value? Like, where are those key wedges that make them decide, this product versus that product? That'll be something that I think will come up a bit later as we hear about Omnada's story of developing their pricing model to really differentiate, again, their pricing. And what are the motivations ultimately? Like, why are they choosing this product over an alternative? I think you really need to understand this. Like, what is your truly differentiable, non-table stakes kind of pieces that really make you set apart? Because those are places where there's an opportunity for value creation, value capture. And understanding why your customers might choose you over someone else, again, super critical. And for those of you who work in product development, a lot of this stuff probably is, quite obvious, right? Like, this is really ultimately what you do, but this has to be the starting point. What is your customer's willingness to pay, right? When you talk to your customers in terms of their alternatives, that really sets the bounds for the pricing discussion. And when you think about, the price or the overall costs, or even, how much value capture you might have from an account, understanding, their current budget. Are they in market? Are they actually spending money on this problem? That's a question I've asked in past roles when I worked on monetization. I don't talk to people who aren't spending money on the problem. They're a waste of your time. Frankly, you should really be talking to people who have those budgets, because that'll help you understand willingness to pay. And that really sets a bounds, again, for the discussion around, what will come in the next slide around the amount of how much you're going to spend. And then another thing to really kind of anchor, and we'll tie to this on the next slide, is how often they have this problem. Is this, a problem they occur daily? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? And the reason is you really want to align price to value. So, you're going to have to think about, if the problem is monthly, you might have to charge on a monthly basis. If it's daily, you might have an opportunity to charge daily. These are things that will have a direct input into how you think about when to charge. So again, these are just kind of the key pieces. There's perhaps other ways to frame this, but I find that these steps have always helped really develop any pricing model I've ever worked on. And then from there, this is really, I think, where the business view comes in. So the product, kind of the customer view, will inform, I think, a lot of these elements, and ultimately these two things kind of go hand in hand. So how does your price scale with value? How does your customer think about the price as they kind of use it more, it expands in their organization, they get more usage? Again, if these things are disconnected, ultimately, it creates risks with your model. It could potentially create churn. So you'll want to kind of think about your kind of value metric, make sure that scales ultimately with value. There's multiple ways to think about that value metric. You might be feature differentiated. You might think about different features that you offer, starter plans, professional plans, teams. You get more functionality across those different SKUs. You might have usage-based metrics, something that scales with a function of usage, obviously Snowflake with credits. Omnada is an interesting one because it's going to be both usage and feature differentiated. And then you can also differentiate based on outcomes. Are you generating leads? Are you generating sales? Are you generating savings? We have actually apps on Marketplace that charge by the amount of savings that they bring to your Snowflake instance. So that's just completely aligned to value. It's a very easy story to tell a procurement team. So again, a lot of those customer conversations and understanding your customer really, I think, inform these different pieces. And as you think about, those value metrics, there's different ways to kind of approach them across your different SKUs. They may scale linearly by some value, the number of seats, or I see a lot of AI ML apps now just charging by minutes of use, tokens for LLMs. So that's just a simple continuous scale. You might try and discreetly ban those and say, for the first 10, first 100, there's different prices. Again, going back to where your customer's spending their money, how they think about value will really inform how to choose one versus the other. In terms of the amount, I mentioned this earlier. This is where there's often the most amount of focus because it's the most visible change that you might have or hypothesis you might have for your monetization model. But I think the only kind of things I've seen here is thinking about how much you might charge per customer, not per seat, right? Per account. What is your kind of goal? What is their willingness to pay on an account level? That might inform more of how you think about the amount than individual customers. So if you, for instance, are going after SMB versus enterprise, obviously it's a very different amount that per account or per customer might spend. How important, how severe your problem is to them, that's going to obviously change the scales here. And again, understanding their willingness to pay, understanding the value of your use case for them should ultimately inform this. And as I mentioned earlier, when do you charge? In the case of Omnata, they charge ultimately when you sync, when you use the product. That might be daily. Some products ultimately only give value weekly, monthly. So you'll have to think ultimately about aligning the charge model to when that problem occurs. So those are some of the kind of key pieces I think that I think align. The customer hypotheses then inform the business model, which I think give you a set of options that you can then use to say, here are different models we might actually hypothesize or might actually deploy. And for a lot of companies that have already gone down this journey, they might have already said, hey, we've already done this. This isn't really relevant to us. We've gone down this path. We've kind of got, our go-to-market figured out. We've got our pricing figured out. And I've really challenged you that, monetization is not really set and forget. The truth is the market's changing. Your customers are changing. Your product's evolving. A lot of this can feel very sensitive and hard to change. And ultimately, I think that leaves money on the table for your competitors to go after. And ultimately, I think it's hard to get it right on the first try. So this should be like any product, a place where you're kind of willing to experiment, willing to try new things. And as we hear from Chris shortly, they'll talk about how they literally went from V1 to V2 based on the customer feedback they were getting. And they're already thinking, okay, where can we go next? And I think that kind of product-centric mindset to this problem is really helpful to help evolve monetization and not keep it stale as your product and as your market changes. And kind of one of the last things I want to talk about is, if you've already maybe gone down the journey, if you've already kind of set a lot of these pieces, I would challenge you to think about, some of the things that I think some of our customers can struggle with is how can you reduce friction at all costs to get started? Like making activation as easy as possible. In every product I've worked on, monetization is kind of the first thing a growth team will work on, but sometimes the challenge is customers aren't seeing value early. So, we're always kind of digging ourselves out of that hole. And one of the really interesting things about Snowflake is, providers don't pay for compute that the consumer uses, right? You're just paying for storage in the regions that you deploy your application. So it actually gives you a lot of, opportunity to effectively deliver your trial product as cheaply, essentially free, as possible. And when you talk to your customers, and you have these pricing conversations, be candid with them. Do they understand it? Is there kind of what's pushing them away? What's pulling them in? Do they understand how, ultimately, how it scales over time? Because I think if you can get someone in, but then it doesn't scale with their usage, you're going to risk churn over time. So really thinking about, how does perceived value work as the cost scale, so that you can get ahead of potential, again, disconnects between kind of your customer point of view and your business point of view. And as we kind of talked about on the prior slide, you should always really lead with this customer point of view. Don't let the business model kind of pull you in too far first. Make sure that you're grounded with an understanding of your customers, even as your product is evolving, as your market is changing, to make these changes. And when you make the changes, you have to optimize more for, I would say, the longer term. Because when you do make changes, it's tempting to maybe do discounts and do things that ultimately might move a needle, but frankly, those types of changes kind of don't have a long-term point of view, it's really important to kind of think about where is your product going, where your customer's going, because any change that you make will affect retention, will affect engagement, could affect trial conversion. So kind of having a point of view of like where your product's going, where you're going, will ultimately, I think, help you make the most impactful changes to this model. And so you do need to consider really all kind of stages of a life cycle of your customer as you make these changes. And I would say, lastly, all revenue is not created equal, right? So it's really easy to kind of think about, okay, we want to drive revenue, and there's cost of acquisition, cost to serve, cost of revenue. And as I mentioned, it's quite cheap to ultimately deliver your product on Snowflake. But I think there's obviously a graveyard of startups that aren't thinking about their cost to serve, their cost to acquire customers, and how that's going to reach kind of favorable unit economics over time. And so this is an area where I think there's probably the most amount of literature, so we don't need to go into too many details. It's easy to find a lot of stuff online. But I would just say, make sure that you're measuring the cost of acquiring and serving your customers as you're growing. Make sure that you understand LTV of these customers and you have a model for these things over time. That might take time to develop, but it's worthwhile. And of course, contribution margin, payback periods, and all these types of things. Because if you don't have these things dialed in, there's really no point in making small changes. It really is not going to serve the long-term business. And lastly, for things that I think kind of I've seen, struggles amongst kind of our customers is a lot of folks are coming in with a sales-led motion, which is great. But with the Snowflake Marketplace, it does offer an opportunity for you to have a sales-led or a sales assist type motion. So you might come in with flat rate pricing where you ultimately have kind of large commitments from your customers. And I think it's really hard, honestly, to build out kind of a motion or a mindset for what a product-led growth, or I would say a self-serve kind of motion for your customers might look like. But I think this is emerging. We're starting to see more bottoms-up procurement. We're starting to see more customers, obviously they've got marketplace capacity drawdown, ready to spend. The fact that they can trial your product and get value from it makes them a much more qualified lead than somebody, say, just looking at a listing or looking at your website and gets on a sales demo. And a lot of these customers on Snowflake are very technical, right? They want to use your product. They want to understand what it does. And I think this is probably one of the hardest bridges for folks to cross, but it does also present an opportunity for partners to think about how can we put something out there that at least showcases value, gives a little bit of value, doesn't really cost us that much, other than if there's some development cost to maintain it. And then folks that are then using that product, even if it's free, you get that lead information. First name, last name, email address when they mount your app. Whether they're using it. I mean, these are your most qualified leads. And this is really where you'd want to focus your sales team. So I think that's a big opportunity that's frankly missed today. And so to the folks that kind of want to experiment with that or have the opportunity to, I think they get a bit of an advantage. So I'm going to pass over to Chris because I think ultimately his story will kind of hopefully kind of reiterate some of these pieces. And I think it was a very interesting journey to watch. And so I'd love for him to come tell his story.
Thanks, Eric. So Omnata is a native app partner of Snowflake's. We're from Australia. Both James and I are the co-founders. And we've been involved in the Snowflake ecosystem for a while. So James was one of the first enterprise customers in Australia. And I was at Tableau when I first found out about Snowflake. And it was the data warehouse that made Tableau actually do what it said on the box. So I'm going to talk about our journey. We joined this program of native apps really early, like possibly too early when it was still a bit of a dream. But I'm glad we're here now because, we're seeing the results of it already. So what do? Just quickly, we're a native integration app for Snowflake. We run completely natively on Snowflake, and we sync in both directions, so bi-directional, to SaaS endpoints and also databases. So we're solving a really big problem. It's a problem that every Snowflake customer has, especially when they adopt Snowflake for the first time. Everybody has to get their data in. And so why would we leap into this crazily crowded, saturated market? Well, because we saw an opportunity from what the standard was. Now, this is the hardest working diagram in tech, as my co-founder and I refer to it. The left to right flow of data with some central point in the middle. Everything does it. But what we were being told was that you come armed with some piece of integration middleware, you pull your data out of the sources, you land it in Snowflake. You generate some insights. If you want to send that data somewhere else for it to be used, then you come armed with another piece, you pull it out, and you send it off to the targets. Now, there obviously was a better way to do this, and we saw in the buyer's challenges it was a symptom of the architecture, basically. So when you buy SaaS apps, you're just paying for the same stuff over and over, and it's not differentiated. You're paying for public cloud bills, basically. And when you're doing something like moving data, you're just racking up those bills, and that vendor has to pay that on. So servers, deployment engineers, us being an Australian region, like we were always, down the list of places for SaaS apps to pop up. And so Snowflake native apps have just completely changed that, especially for a small vendor like us. And so the buyer challenges were pretty obvious. Like people were in Slack channels and on Reddit, and they're complaining about the tools that exist. Like the cost's too high, everything charges by data volume. It starts out really fine, but then once you're hooked, it kind of gets really expensive. A lot of industries and sectors were off limits because of cybersecurity, handling data through another cloud. From one of our customers, we heard when we sold a SaaS version early version of our product, they actually spent as much on their internal chargebacks for cybersecurity review as they did on our software. So we knew if we could get rid of that, we're cutting the total cost of our product by a lot. And then the buying experience, what we saw it was a bit of a game of gotcha. You'd have this product, it'd deliver all this value, and then it's like, oh, but we need SSOs. Okay, well, enterprise plan for you. So we want to get rid of this. And what we saw is that this pricing model was driven by underlying costs. So, you get this nice free tier where the vendor's just eating that cost of you using the platform. And then, once you're kind of processing data and you're hooked, they bump you up to that marginal cost line and then extract the profit as you get bigger and bigger. Now, the problem in our category, when it's a connector, it's something you could have built up front, is that you end up with this infinitely increasing cost of your connector because data always grows. You've always got a new customer. You've always got more clicks. And so really it doesn't align to the customer value. And then digging into the cybersecurity features and the gotcha sales process, it's a bit of an oversimplification, but just to describe, take all those cybersecurity features and why we need them. Well, mostly because it's a SaaS tool, right? And so if those features are the only thing that lever people up to enterprise plans, then the only thing our salespeople are doing is selling features that only exist because it's a SaaS tool. It's a bit of a circular economy. So we differentiate by just not doing any of those things, being a native app. So we don't have cloud infrastructure, we don't have deployment engineering, cybersecurity is taken care of, and then we can get rid of all that stuff that customers are complaining about. Data volume pricing, sales friction, and enterprise plans. So going onto the Snowflake Marketplace, we kind of had these goals in mind of what do we want to do? How do we want to scale this business? Now, we knew that we could deliver a lower cost. We could pass on the savings of being a native app. We were more secure, so we could skip over that cybersecurity process, and we'd be faster and easier. Because we're not a new vendor, Snowflake's billing, it'd be easier to be approved and purchased and go through that procurement process. Now, our goal also was to distribute only through the Snowflake Marketplace. We want to sell to the core users of Snowflake, data engineers, business users on the platform. We want to sell to the line of business executives, but we don't want this to be a big decision. We don't want to be schmoozing CIOs to try and sell them a six-figure deal. And I guess a note for maybe the up-and-coming providers out there is that Snowflake does tend to land you into the enterprise as it skews enterprise in their customer base. So a traditional kind of startup, you'd sell to the startup down the road. Whereas what we're doing is landing in a marketplace that has all these enterprise customers. So we had to be prepared to talk to enterprise accounts straight away. And so our other goal was let's look at connectors from a cost basis. So as a category commoditizes, and connectors are definitely in that category, the value metric shifts. So, you start out, you can capture all this value, and then you slowly chip away as it gets easier and easier to do what you do. So looking into the future, there were open source options getting adoption. There's Gen AI, where people can just build connectors using AI. And the Snowflake framework made it a lot easier to integrate data. So we had to examine it from a different perspective. So we decided, well, let's look at this from the cost to the customer if they were to do it themselves. And so if you think about that cost as time goes on, you spend a bunch of effort to get it working, you finally get it working, and then you drop back down onto just like maintenance level, which is all well and good until something changes or something breaks, and you're slowly just undulating along the resources you have to invest in this connector. So we wanted to be just cheaper than that, more certain than that, and that would take care of anything that goes above us by a long shot. So onto our actual pricing model. What did we model out? Well, as Eric said, we were literally changing our minds every day. And I think if you're an emerging provider, you've got to be comfortable with just going with something and then changing it. And Snowflake makes it pretty easy to change. But we modeled out a few things. So we thought, well, let's just stick with the norm. Let's just go by record. Gives you a really nice natural upsell because data always grows. That didn't line up with our product message. It's not where we thought the category was going. And we just didn't want to charge on something we didn't incur. It's kind of hard to back it up if you're charging on something that's a bit pretend. We also decided, well, a step on from that is like, let's just charge per sync. But we found the maths is too hard. So a daily refresh of a sync is 1, but if you do 1 minute, that's 1,440. So you have to have this like log curve, way too hard to explain, and you don't want to make your pricing difficult. So we thought, well, what if we bucket it into tiers and charge for freshness? So daily is one thing, bump up to hourly, maybe bump up to real time or near real time. But again, while it created this value metric that scaled, it didn't work out for everything. There's a lot of sources, a lot of companies that just run on daily. Doesn't matter how valuable the data is, that's just how they roll. And so it kind of added complexity for little gain, in our opinion. So what did we decide? Well, we decided to keep it simple with a flat price. So if you use a connector, if you use an inbound sync, and if you use an outbound sync, you end up with just a flat daily value. And we wanted a daily active value because we wanted people to just be able to convert, like press buy, and the transaction could actually be 0 until they start using it. So just a quick note before I explain our V1 pricing, but our app architecture looks like this. So a customer actually has to install 2 native apps. One is our main sync engine, and the other is the connector. Now, the big benefit of this is that customers can build their own connectors, and then we can also ship connectors individually without pushing this huge app update. So that's a little note if you're building a native app out there, just on some of the ways that you can work with that. But what we wanted to do was like clip the ticket if a customer built a custom connector and just charge a small admin fee for them to use our engine. So the V1, we had a paid listing as our sync engine, and then also a paid listing for each connector. And so if a customer used a custom connector, we would just charge the sync engine fee. So this was great. We were capturing this value. We had this whole strategy that all these people would come in and build custom connectors. However, it caused some limits to adoption. So the fact that your listing is paid actually reduces the amount of people that are going to click on it by a lot. One of the other things we did was offer free connectors. So Google Sheets is a freebie that we give you, and a customer had to have a paid sync engine with a free connector, and that didn't work out. It kind of screwed up that whole onboarding of free customers using Google Sheets. The other thing is math is hard. People don't like adding up one thing or another. It was really difficult to explain. So V2, so we decided, is let's just wait until loads of people come and build all these custom connectors and they're getting all this value, and then we'll work out, how we're going to generate value from that. Like Eric was saying, it doesn't cost you anything to have people mass adopt your app on Snowflake. Let's wait till they come. So we changed to this. So the sync engine is now free, and we just charge for each connector. So if you upload a custom connector, you get that for free at the moment. And we only charge for the sync directions to each paid plugin. We also shifted from trying to tier our plugin pricing to just pricing everything individually, because some destinations or some endpoints are really painful to build and some are easier. So we changed the pricing depending on that. So what we see ahead and what we're still waiting to see what our approach will be, and you're going to have to be, I guess, comfortable setting an overall pricing direction and then having exceptions to that model. So loads of custom connectors, enterprise deals where people just want all you can eat, and then things like OEM and app developers who are going to have many customer endpoints. It's something that we haven't built yet, and we're waiting to see. But yeah, you have to kind of go on a case-by-case basis for a lot of these edge cases. So the actual billing implementation, and like Eric said, this is the easy part. So we use custom billing events, and so basically you can meter any state in your app, and then you send that off to Snowflake, who bill it for you. Now, to quote my co-founder James, building a billing backend is a massive pain in the back end. And we were just thankful that this was another thing we didn't have to do. So our billing metrics kind of work like this. We have some state tables, which are the connections that people have made, the syncs that they've configured, and then all the runs that have happened. Now, we're interested in connections that are production, because we offer test syncs to sandbox instances for free. And we're interested in what from the sync table, we're interested in what connector they're using. We're looking for the ones that run on a schedule because we give testings for free. And then we're looking at which direction of movement they're using. And then we also give you failed syncs for free, so that's a bit more value. In the sync runs, we're only looking for greater than 1 in the last 24 hours. And just to illustrate conceptually, you pull this together in SQL and then you send those records off to the billing API for them to be billed at the end of the month. Now, this is how it looks for our customers. And we do get a significant amount of misunderstanding because we've skewed from the norm in our category. So honestly, people just don't believe us when we say it's a flat fee. And that's something that we have to explain. Now, the key takeaway of this slide is that the marketplace listings are limited. So I would say don't rely just on the marketplace listing. You should optimize the marketplace listing for the listing, and you should have your own designed pricing page on your website, your own PDFs, email templates, all that ready to go. Because the number of people that have emailed me saying, does it work like this? Will it cost me this much? It's different every time. There's no pattern. And finally, all models will have baggage. So a few things to look out for, especially when billing by custom events, is that you may create loopholes in your product. Now, be mindful, but don't get hung up. So for example, for us, we only charge customers for scheduled data syncs. So manual test syncs are free. Somebody could log in and they could just click test over and over and over again. We let the economics take care of that. If you want to waste your time doing that, be our guest. It'll cost you more doing that than just paying us. The other part is complexity. So, even simple sounding pricing can get really complex. So I kind of said this before, but you'll have an overarching sales and pricing message, and then there are always exceptions and there's always fine print. So better go with the message and then deal with the exceptions later on. And then also when you're billing by product features, be careful you don't box in your future features. So for example, with us, we had to build a lot of logic after the fact to handle our configuration branching and DBT integration features. Didn't line up with the way that we were billing off scheduled syncs. And so I'll hand back over to Eric for some final takeaways and wrap this all up.
Thanks, Chris. So in the end, I think hopefully we made a case that the easiest part is actually just implementing your monetization strategy. We offer a ton of different plans, and we're making more investments here with more announcements to come. That'll ultimately save you time in terms of development cost, as Omnada experienced, as well as help your customers get value faster so that your deal cycles are shorter. So, easy to implement, easy-ish to change, ultimately. And the harder part is really, developing a kind of unique monetization model. Start with your customers, layer on the business hypotheses in your business model, but don't be afraid to ultimately iterate with a longer-term view. And I think that'll set you in a good direction. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us.